right? Each of you are going to get your own sheet of paper. You should have plenty of pages within one sheet. However, this is going to become especially important later when we do things like cutting down book board, because you will be working with like 5 different people to do it, okay? So it's a good idea to give yourself a basic schematic where you have the 26 by 40, generally speaking, is the measurement of our paper. There are a couple papers that are a little smaller than that, so make sure you always measure. But this really smooth paper is 26 by 40. And then I believe the dimensions for your stab bound books is 4 by 6, right? So what we're going to do is essentially divide into this, but we need a visual representation just to make sure that we're doing the math right, okay? Surprise, geometry, okay? So generally speaking, the smallest measure is going to go on the smallest measure, right? So the 4 inches, we're going to measure from the 26, okay? So if you can't do mental math like me, actually I think I can do the mental math. It's just sort of happening magically right now. So you can essentially get 6 out of this 26, right? 6 times 4, 24. So just draw out 6 little columns. They don't have to be proportionate, but you need to have some kind of visual representation of them. And then make sure that you remind yourself you're going to have excess. Okay, a couple of inches right there. Very literally 2 inches, a couple. Right? Note to yourself what's 4, what's 2, so that you know where you're starting. It's also important to note that because you will probably see a couple of little tiny dings on the paper, you're going to want to try to avoid those when you're tearing them down, or at least minimize them, right? Again, you can, I almost said microwave, you can iron your paper. I mean, you could microwave it. I don't know what that would do. Report back. But you might want to take out like little areas like this that have a divot to them from being handled when they were shipped to us too. So those are the types of things you'll want to do. Then we'll take 6 out of 40. That one I might not get. 8, right? 8 to 6. Okay. So, boop. I would suggest not doing this on lined paper, but this is what I had with me. And then remind yourself that these are going to be 6 inches. It's a good idea to do it as if you were, carpenters do it this way, as if you're measuring out pieces, because that is what you're doing, right? And then I'll have a little bit of excess there. 4 inches, right, of excess on the edge. If I'm getting 6 times 6, 36. Yeah, 4. I picked a field where I only have to interact with math kind of every day, actually, now that I think about it. Can you imagine how fascinatingly complicated it was to work out all the math to order the paper for y'all? It was an experience. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So you should be able to get 36 sheets out of this. Plenty of sheets for yourself, right? Even if you have a couple mess ups. The important thing to do is this is not a situation like the accordion book where you can just fold, right? You need to measure each of these different places. So measure 3 times, cut once. I like that I've added an extra time, but that really is the case with paper. There's not really anything you can do to pretend like you have it. I'm gonna measure from this side, again, because this corner is all dinged up. And I'm gonna make sure that I'm doing, so I have memory issues, which is also part of why I write everything down, but I'm gonna be doing 6 all along this. Please use the right angles, if at all possible, so that you know you're right up against that edge of the paper, okay? Don't rely too much on that. They can still be wrong over time. These screws get loose, right? But try and keep it consistent. If you end up with like wonky sheets of paper, you can imagine in a stack of paper, it's very obvious, right? So we've got 6, 12, 18, 24, and 32. And then I'm gonna always pick this first line, set up a rule for yourself. Try not to change a bunch of things, make a bunch of variables happen with your measurement. So I'm always going to measure from this line, that additional 6. Okay, 10 to 4. How many am I going to have at the end? 4. Interesting. Do I already have all 6? 1, 2, 3.
This one right here is worth 1.
Yeah, what was I doing? Thank you. Memory issues. I told you. And actually now we can just go right here at the end.
There's your board.
Beautiful. Okay. So, again, 3 times, cut once. You can do more if you want to. 3 times in general is usually enough for you to see any kind of mistakes you're making. When I say that, I mean essentially the things that are, how to describe it, the things that are little kind of notches that aren't perfectly aligned, especially if this is wiggly, right? You'll be able to see them at 3 lines, and then you can kind of split the difference between them all. 24 and 30. Right, I did 32 instead of 30. I almost forgot the last one. Beep, beep, beep. And again, keep it consistent where you measure that. So if you're somebody who's going to measure from this edge, which is technically more correct, do it. I prefer the straight edge side so that I know for sure that's the end of the ruler. Okay. If you want to have a second person with you when you measure, that might actually help you. Any guesses why that is?
Double check your work.
Yeah,
They can help check, but also when you get farther away from yourself, you're more likely to do this type of a thing and not notice, right? Because you're so far away from it that you might not perceive that crookedness, or the paper might be crooked or something like that. Exactly, yeah. So 6, 12. Is this the most riveting thing that's ever happened to you? Watching a person just measure a bunch of things? So, worry about one thing at a time, one measurement at a time. Don't go ahead and do the entire grid, okay? So what we're gonna do is first I'm gonna double check that these align properly. Okay, there's like a bit of a curve to these, but they're pretty close. Am I up against the paper edge there?
Now you are.
Okay, so I'm gonna commit to that. I'm gonna check one more space just to make sure consistently across the way I've done it right. I would urge you to check all of them, but I'm sure that you don't wanna watch me do this for 100 hours, so. Check as many times as you can. Another type of paper that's really, or type of ruler that's really good for this other than a right angle is fabric rulers, because they're often clear, so you can see the kind of relationships between them, but they also have interior lines, so even if the edge over time gets a little bit warped, the interior lines don't. Just a kind of general tip. And then I brought my own tear bar today. But we still have this one. I wanted to make sure 2 people could be doing paper at a time, so we're not all just sitting here going. And you'll line this up as much as you possibly can with the lines that you've drawn. There will be a little bit, generally speaking, of variance, usually in the middle, but try and average them out visually, right? I'm gonna take this as my general average, It's a little bit far this way on the center measurement, but it's a little bit far this way. So I'm somewhere in between those two lines is probably the
So
right
would you want
place.
to measure up with the middle line if possible, or?
Measure up with the most lines possible.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. Good question. One other thing that I'm going to stop really quickly and point out to you is you do want to make sure that you're tearing on the correct side of the paper. So with this paper, the way that you know that you're on the front versus the back is the amount, how smooth it is essentially. Feel free to touch this because it'll give you that kind of knowledge. You can tell that one side is smoother than the other, right? The rougher side is the back. You can also look at it in the light, and if you see more texture on one side than the other, then that's probably the back. This is technically the front. I'm going to do it wrong on purpose. Please do not do it this way, right? Put your lines on the back, tear it on the back. I should have told you that at the beginning. I'm doing it the wrong way because I want you to see what happens with the decal when it's facing the wrong way. Okay. So,
Unlike before, though, Becky, we're doing the short end now instead of before we were cutting with the long end when we did our accordion books.
please rephrase. I didn't quite understand.
Instead of cutting small pieces, we were cutting the small pieces, but using the big end. When we were cutting, we were pulling on the big end.
Yes.
So we're opposite this time?
It doesn't really matter,
Okay.
but the reason I'm doing it this way is these strips are so small that I'm less likely to cause dimples pulling this way than I am pulling this way. If you're left-handed and you want to pull this way, perfectly logical, totally fine. This is just a little bit easier to handle, especially because I was observing everyone is shorter than I am, I guess is the way that I'm going to say it. And I noticed that in some cases that was probably
Hard to do
causing.
that. Yeah, that's what I was
Yes.
asking, because I'm like,
Yeah. So it's not the end of the world to do it this way. And in fact, in this case, with this size paper, I would suggest doing it this way. If you have a more manageable size paper, like the poster boards that we had, do it the opposite way, if you can. Yes, good question. And thank you for rephrasing it. So again, gently grab the top corner. Don't pull, don't squeeze, nothing. And pull towards yourself. This is more about the pulling than it is about how well you're holding this. Please pay attention to the angle I'm doing that at, right? You don't need to do it like this. Do it as close and as flush to that edge as you can. And again, try not to move your hand too much. If you're hanging off the edge of a table, or actually if you're hanging off the edge of a table, make sure that your paper's just all the way on the table before you finish, okay? If you're hanging off the edge of a mat, make sure you do this next part really slowly, right? The reason for that is if you don't pull that slowly, you'll end up with a little extra tab. This essentially works on the principle of a very specific angle, but also the idea that there's pressure on the back of the paper. If you have it fully hanging off the edge of the paper or the edge of the table like this, it's much more likely to not actually have that reinforcement on the back of it. Okay. So instead of making you watch me tear all of this down, we're just gonna move straight on to the next step. We'll do two more, actually, so I can show you something quick.
I see the difference.
Yes.
Cutting it on the wrong edge.
Yeah.
See that?
Yeah.
That is pretty bad.
Yes. So this is kind of what you want to think about with the decal. You want this kind of frumpled up edge, right? And I'll pass this around. The more I touch it, the flatter it gets, so I'll just pass it around. But you want that crumpled up edge to be facing the back of the page. Okay. not the other way around. So that kind of volume that happens there, it's almost like a burr.
Yeah.
If for some reason you're looking at something and your brain goes, that doesn't look quite right, there's something off here, remeasure it. Don't just go for it. Okay, take your time with this. It's not a rodeo. You're not in a rush. Here's the other side of that, so you can kind of see this is supposed to be the front of the paper, and there's a weird kind of buckling happening. But the back side of the paper is smooth, so you want to plan for that.
So when we do this, the front side needs to be the one on the table.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. That's also good because that protects it from this potentially being dirty, but that's why I told you to clean your tables. Okay. In fact, let's remove these because these are clean enough. I want to see how gross these tables are. Sorry for the noise. So this is what I mean when you go a little too fast, right? I tore a little too much off at that end. Curious if this side is all gross and dirty. Not too bad. We've got a couple of little specks, but those will show up in your book. So you want to keep them as clean as possible. I've got a couple other little marks on the edges as well. Would you hand me this, please?
I'm still playing with something.
It's a nice paper. I quite like it. So at this stage, you'll have 6 of these, right? I only have 3 because I don't want to do this for the rest of our lives. You can stack them. If you are going to stack them to tear them, I would not stack more than 2. I'm going to stack 3 to show you why initially. Okay. One thing to note is when you stack them, they're not always exactly the same length. So if you've already got a small measurement issue, stacking them is going to make it worse, right? It's going to become more and more noticeable. So keep that in mind before you stack them. Check and see if the edges actually line up well. Mine line up pretty good. One of them is a little bit off, just a little bit. It's this one, right? Not so bad that it would be totally noticeable, but it's about a 32nd of an inch maybe in one place. So we'll see how bad that gets as we go. So again, using this, one thing that I would suggest is if you're going to do this, you might want to clip the pages together in a central point. Use a smaller clip than this one. I didn't realize I grabbed the jumbo clips. But you don't want them to move around while you measure. A really important thing when you do that is to make sure the edges are lined up. They're not here. I'm going to proceed. Again, I want to show you what they'll look like when you mess up. Okay, this is our 4-inch measurement. So, while I do this, one thing that I wanted to talk to you all about is I haven't heard back from everybody yet on what they would prefer to do for their final project. I saw a couple of votes for box, so we'll take a final vote today. Now that we've had some time to like percolate the idea in our mind. I don't know why I took this off. But something to keep in mind, I'm actually going to move this down here. Think about it as we're working today. Another thing that we will also be doing is I'm going to remove because more people voted for box initially, I decided we're going to move this so that we don't have a hardcover on these. They're going to be paper covers instead. Okay. Not much changes. You're still going to learn the basics, but I'd rather us save the hardcover for case binding, which is how like novels are bound, right? So that this book is case bound, right?
So we're not finding different cover materials?
You can still find different cover
I was
materials.
gonna say, is it
That's
okay if I
perfectly
still
fine.
use the board that I brought?
Yes, yes. So if you have like recycled material of some kind, totally fine, because that's not going to be as thick as the book board. Yeah.
Yeah, mine was a previous book cover.
Right, we talked about that. We'll talk about it, and I might just show everybody when we're working on yours, what we end up doing. Okay. So again, make sure you have at least 3 of these. And please note, again, I have this kind of crooked edge, right? I'm doing that on purpose. We'll talk about why in a minute. I mean, it's a little bit predictable what's going to happen when you have an edge that's crooked. Again, because these are so small, you should tear the small side first. Something that's going to happen is a curl. You can mitigate that, make that less noticeable by tearing really slowly. So I'll show you the difference. Another thing you can do is if you stack them, you can tear 2 at a time. Again, I would recommend 2 at a time only, but we'll go real slow with this one. Right, that's a less severe curl than what I initially had with this one, which was a little bit more like that. Okay, so nice and slow. This is the reason why you don't have 3. Let's see if it messes up. Good. So if you stack 3, you'll start to notice they get a little bit broader at the base over time. You get a little bit of extra decal. Once you get to 3, it becomes noticeable when they're stacked together. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so 2 at a time, fine. 3 at a time, okay, I guess, if that's what you want to do to yourself. But it will have impacts on what you do. So another thing to kind of point out as we go is, again, we're stacking paper. So when we see paper stacked, any kind of incongruency becomes abundantly obvious. I'm going to get 6 pages before I show you what I mean. I'm going to continue doing this wrong. You could also hear that sounded wrong, right? Mm-hmm. So we're getting, this is really what I was hoping you would see. You see that little triangle? Mm-hmm. That's happening because we're tearing too many things at once. So if your measurements aren't precise, what will happen is you'll end up with some real interesting edges, right? And they become abundantly obvious when they're all stacked together. So try to avoid this. I say this with care. The first time you tear a bunch of pieces of paper, it's probably gonna happen, right? But do your best to avoid it. If you find yourself rushing for any reason, take a break, do something else, go back to it, okay? Try to avoid it as much as you can because this becomes really inescapable. And at this point, you could go back in and try and tear it again to get the decal back, but really you're just gonna have to cut it, right? And we're aiming for that decal because it has a little bit more character to it and it's a little more traditional as far as the way that we tear paper, okay? Does anybody have any questions about any of this? Okay. You excited to make your little books? Yeah? Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and just hand this over to everybody so they can do their paper tearing.